Welcome to this Bible study on Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. So let's take a look at verse 6. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Essentially, Paul here, he's moved beyond the greeting of the letter in the first 5 verses, and now he's addressing the Galatians. And the first thing he says to them is, I'm astonished. He's amazed. He can't believe that the Galatians are so quickly deserting the gospel of grace in Jesus Christ. They're turning away from grace. And the language he uses there, notice the language deserting. It's a military term. In other words, they are deserting. They're like soldiers who's enlisted for service, and now they're going AWOL. Now they're running away. They're deserting the troop. And essentially, that's not a good thing. It's not strong language of what the Galatians are doing. Hence why he's writing to them and confronting them about this. So what are they deserting? They are deserting the gospel of grace. They're deserting Christ. They're essentially moving from liberty, which they had, freedom in Christ, the grace of God. They're moving from liberty and grace to legalism and works. Now, works, and that's a danger not only of the Galatians, but anybody who knows Jesus Christ, because works seem attractive, and it's tempting to say, okay, we've been saved by grace, and now it's up to me to follow Christ, as though we were saved by grace, but now the rest of the Christian life is up to us. Now, admittedly, there's an active part. There's an active part for all of us to play. We all have to be active in our Christianity. But the Christian life begins with grace and continues with grace. We're merely trying to connect to the electricity. We put ourselves in the place where God's grace can work in us, even after we've been believers. We're just putting ourselves in a place where God can work in us. The Christian life begins with grace and it continues with grace. And we should not turn away from grace into works. We should just merely put ourselves in a place where God's grace can work in us. But now let's look at verse 7. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Jesus Christ. Paul was well aware of these Judaizers, and he was astonished that the Galatians were listening to these false teachings and these false gospels. And it kind of resonated with them during that time period because the Judaizers had a Jewish background, as some of the people that Paul's addressing here did. So they would come along after Paul preached grace as the beginning, convert, believe in Jesus by grace through, and then here they come along and say, well, okay, now you've been saved by grace, now you have to go back and do these laws and these Old Testament customs as well. Well, essentially they were adding to the gospel. They were perverting it. They were changing and twisting the very nature of the gospel, adding to it. It was saying it wasn't enough to be saved by grace, now you have to also do works too. So it was grace and works. Now, that's not what the gospel taught. That wasn't what Paul preached. So that was a danger. And so the two characteristics of the false teachers are that they were troubling the church and they were changing the gospel. Now, what kind of reaction did Paul have to these false teachers? It wasn't a light one. He was indignant. So let's look at verses 8 and 9 together. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse. Strong language here. Paul's indignant at these false teachers. He's astonished that the Galatians are listening to him. And hence he uses the word anathema, under God's curse, cut off from God, that these people would be cut off from God and essentially thrown into hell. And so why in the world did Paul feel so strongly and use such drastic language? There were 2 reasons. The first is that the glory of Christ was at stake. The glory of Christ was at stake. To make men's works necessary to salvation, even as a supplement to the work of Christ, it's derogatory. It's derogatory to the finished work of Christ. It is to imply that Christ's work was in some way not good enough or unsatisfactory, and that men need to add to it and improve upon it. It is in effect to declare the cross redundant. And if justification were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose here. So, it's the work of Christ and the glory of Christ that's at stake there, first. But there's a second reason why Paul felt this matter so strongly, that the good of men's souls were at stake. There were souls at stake here, eternal destinies at stake. And he was not writing about some trivial doctrine here, but about something that is fundamental to the gospel. Nor was he speaking of those who merely hold false views, but of those who teach them and mislead others by their teaching. So these false teachers were essentially, they were playing games with people's souls and eternal destinies. So Paul took this very serious, and he was indignant at these false teachers and at their perverted gospel. Now, in verse 10, we see a contrast here. Paul says there are those who are looking for human approval by the works that they do, and there are those who are servants of Christ and living solely for God's glory and his approval. Let's look at verse 10. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. Paul's merely just pointing out to us here that, hey, we should be seeking God's glory. We should be serving him. We should be living for his approval. We shouldn't be striving for human approval. We shouldn't be doing things to look good in the eyes of other human beings. We're not trying to please other people. We're trying to please God. So what do we learn in verses 6 through 10? First, we learn to live in grace. We are saved by grace. We continue in grace throughout the rest of our Christian lives. We are saved from grace. The Christian life begins with grace, and it continues by grace. Secondly, we must realize that there are those who will lead you astray from grace. Essentially, there are those who will say, the devil, our own human flesh and temptations, and the world around us will teach us that we have to, that grace isn't enough, that we have to look good, that we have to essentially do these works and do these right things. But we must realize that there are those forces in our world that will lead us astray. And third, seek God's approval and not the approval of others. Seeking God's glory, seeking his approval, and serving him is what it's all about. And what others think about us isn't as important and shouldn't be our motivator as much as seeking God's kingdom and his righteousness, as Matthew 6:33 teaches us, and also these verses. So seek God's approval, live for his grace, and realize that there are other forces in this world that will lead us away.